Chapter 7 in our book is all about photosynthesis, which is the basis of how most ecosystems gain energy and sugar. Let's move right into it. And as this picture shows, photosynthesis is the use of light, carbon dioxide, and water in a reaction within generally plant cells. Some bacteria and algae can do this as well, to generate carbohydrates and oxygen. This is the first part of the video where we're going to just cover part of the photosynthesis cycle. The second part will, the second video will cover the Calvin cycle. Often light reactions are broken into two parts. So one requires light and one doesn't need light to proceed, but it needs the products of the light process in order to proceed. Anyway, I'll go over a general outline of what we're going to talk about, hopefully in this short video. I know you've seen it before, so I will show you again the chemical equation for photosynthesis and the chemical equation for respiration. It is very, very important that you understand the connection between these two and how they are related. Then briefly we will talk about the properties of light. How can you make something from light if you don't exactly know what it is or how to define it? We'll also talk more in depth about the parts of the plant and which parts you really need to know and know the names of to understand their role in the photosynthetic process. Once we've covered the parts so you know what's happening where, we will give a brief overview of the whole process, light dependent and light independent reactions. Then we will go further into only the light dependent reactions in this video, which will cover how light is harvested and used to make ATP and NADPH. So like before, we've already been over cellular respiration, so you know what NADH is. NADPH is basically, we'll just call it the photosynthetic version of an electron carrier. Now these are the reactions for photosynthesis and respiration. Before I tell you what they are, see if you can figure out which is which. This slide is what I want to use to try to show you the relationship between respiration and photosynthesis, how they do cycle into each other. It's not the best sort of representation. This boils down to the chemical equation for how an ecosystem functions. Ultimately, first you've got light coming in, which is the energy that is used by plants or bacteria or algae when they take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and water, if it's a plant, comes up from the soil through the roots. All three of these things are used to generate sugar, for which the plant can grow and also store energy that it can burn later, and its waste product is oxygen. Cycling this back around to here, that respire aerobically, like you and I, need sugar, we need food, we need fuel. This is essentially fuel to burn. And fuel is burned in the presence of oxygen, which we obtain from the atmosphere. To get the energy out of those bonds, we break them internally. This is where energy becomes one of our products. Then carbon dioxide and water are the waste products that we generate from burning our food. Now, before we start talking more about how plants harness light and turn it into sugar and food for themselves and other things, I think we need to go over the definition of light. What is light? How do you define it? How do you quantify gaining energy from something that you can't touch? This is the picture from your book showing the spectrum of light, where on the very, very short wavelength end you've got gamma rays, and on the long end we've got radio waves. It's important to understand that light exists and can be measured in many different ways. It has many properties. Light exists as a wave. It can even exist as mass. It exists as energy. But what we're going to look at is the relationship between the wavelength of light and how much energy it has. In terms of photosynthesis, light is described as a packet of energy, and that packet of energy is called a photon. Photons can have different levels of energy, different amounts of energy, much like an electron can exist at different energy states, different levels of excitement, so to speak. Looking at the spectrum of light, length, 10 to the negative 5 nanometers, up to thousands of meters, kilometers, for the length of a wave of light. On the 400 end of visible light, that's a distance of 400 nanometers, so purplish colored light has a very short wavelength in comparison to red colored light, 750 nanometers. It's much larger. Now a photon at this light range, the energy of a photon is inversely related to the wavelength, meaning sort of opposite, where the shorter the wavelength, the higher the energy. The longer the wavelength, the lower the energy of that particular photon. It makes sense to me because I think about how much faster a short wave, I imagine, can travel than a long wave. So for the short waves, if you watch the mouse, it just kind of travels like this. To me, that looks pretty fast, so I see that's how I correlate it to a high energy photon. On the other end, if you've got a large wavelength, I imagine it moves a little bit slower, so that is a lower energy photon. These photons come into play as generally most plants have leaves. That's where they absorb the sunlight coming in from space. So we need to talk a little bit about the structure of the leaf and the cells inside the leaf. A close-up version of this little cutout of the leaf. Now, I do want you to remember we're looking at the underside of the leaf here. These are stomata. And I do make mistakes. I forget that a single stomata is called a stoma. These are essentially the mouth of the plant, where it takes in carbon dioxide, as the picture shows, which is the fuel that it needs to make more plant and photosynthesize, and releases oxygen, which is the byproduct or the waste product from photosynthesis. One issue that a plant has, though, is that these are really the only openings where a plant can take in carbon dioxide and release its waste product, oxygen. That means that at the same time, if the stomata remain open, a plant can lose water, which is something that it needs to perform photosynthesis. It does, remember, pull water up from the soil through the roots to get into the photosynthetic parts of the plant where water is critically needed to perform the process. But water can also be lost when the stomata are open. Just keep that in mind. These veins here are how water gets to the leaves from the roots, but at the same time, different levels of them are how the carbohydrates that the plant makes through the chloroplasts get to the other parts of the plant where energy is needed. And we've looked at chloroplasts. We looked at them in class. We've already looked at them when we were discussing animal and plant cells. They're just a smaller version here so that you can see the little green stacks in a chloroplast cell. There are several terms now that we're going to come across that you're going to need to know. Within the chloroplast, now remember this is an organelle within a eukaryotic cell full of liquid where those little flat green discs are stacked. So the liquid in the cell is called the stroma. Be very careful to keep that identified in your mind separately from the stoma. Stoma is a singular, stomata, which are the openings in the leaf where the plant essentially breathes. But the stroma, with that R in there, that means it's inside of the cell. And the stroma is the liquid in the chloroplast. Another term you need to be familiar with, as you've noticed that those little green discs inside the chloroplast tend to be stacked on top of each other, that's called a granum. Really, they're not individual discs. It's sort of like the folding of the inner membrane of a mitochondria, just compressed. Now we need to incorporate all of these so that you can understand how photosynthesis works. Moving from life size, looking at a leaf, you go to the underside and view a stoma, or stomata, plural. Smaller than the stomata within the individual cells are where you have the chloroplasts. That's inside the cell. That is just an organelle within the cell that's got a double membrane, inner and outer. And this is what I was talking about before, how you can see the granum are really not individually stacked discs. They just kind of look that way. To me, it looks like someone shoved a mitochondria into a tennis ball can, if it were that large, so that you understand the difference here. Now, a thylakoid is the term for essentially this membrane of the green stacks. The thylakoid space is the space between. Often that is called the lumen. The thylakoid is a membrane, much like the membrane inside a mitochondria. To give you an idea of the overall photosynthetic reaction, this is a condensed picture here. In this video, we're only going to talk about light reactions. In the next video, we're going to talk about the Calvin cycle. These must work in tandem for the plant to get everything that it needs. Light comes in, the light reactions occur, they break water, oxygen is generated as a byproduct. These light reactions also generate ATP and turn NAD+ into NADPH, the essential electron carrier for the Calvin cycle. Now, this Calvin cycle is where carbon dioxide comes into play, because you obviously need carbon to make sugar, which has lots of carbon in it. This will use the NADPH, the electron transports, and it will use a little bit of ATP, allowing those molecules to be recycled and used again in the light reaction, and helping make carbon dioxide into sugar. So here we go with just the light reactions. Now, these are called light reactions because they are light dependent. They are dependent on light existing for them to occur. The Calvin cycle is called light independent because it doesn't need light as a direct input into the system, but it does need the products of the light cycle. I want you to understand the difference there. Now, looking at the chloroplast. Inside the chloroplast are the granum, and the membrane of the granum is a thylakoid, or the thylakoid membrane here. And then the lumen is the space in between. So if we zoom in on that thylakoid membrane, there are clusters of pigment molecules giving this green color embedded in the membrane. And on top of them are energy sort of transfer pigment stations where energy bounces around. And the way this works, okay, your photon, your packet of energy comes in from the sun. And when this packet of energy comes in, it essentially excites these pigment molecules, and they transfer this energy around. What happens, I want you to think of it like you're looking at a pool table, and this is an example from another book. If you imagine if you've played pool, and when you first set up, you've set the balls into a triangle on the table, and you've got the cue ball. When you shoot it at the setup, and say it hits that first ball dead on, and the two balls at the back of the triangle are the ones that shoot off the side. The rest of them stay stationary. So what happened is that energy from the cue ball hit the pyramid of balls and transferred into the two balls at the back, and they shot off. That's sort of what's happening here, is this photon is energy. It's like the cue ball coming in, and this energy gets bounced around until eventually somebody bounces into the reaction center, which is a special location on the pigment molecule that then loses an electron to a primary electron acceptor. What happens that electron gets excited and gets transferred to a proton, most of all. So it's sort of like things get bounced around until it hits this very special location where water has been broken down. One of those protons accepts this electron, okay? And so this excited electron here gets moved through essentially an electron transport chain. Now I want to go back and describe something here. real quickly. Chloroplasts look green, yes? We're going to go back to visible light for just one moment. Green is right about in this spectrum here, and they absorb light pretty much in the red and the red-orange spectrum. They do not absorb light in the green spectrum, or in the wavelengths of green, which is why plants and leaves look green to us. Now looking at this picture here, this just represents one photosystem in a series of two photosystems that plants use for photosynthesis. I also want you to remember that this little section here is called the reaction center, where you have reaction center chlorophyll A and your primary electron acceptor. And a little closer look here, this is where a photon comes in. It's the energy that bounces around, eventually gets handed to the reaction center, where water is broken, so therefore that electron is passed on to a primary electron center. And this is a better description. From that primary electron acceptor, it goes into an electron transport chain. Now for each of these, this has to happen twice, so that 2 electrons can be transferred to the primary electron acceptor. Light comes in, you get at least 2 photons that excite some other pigment molecules on the reaction center and get transferred. Once water is broken, the 2 electrons get transferred to a primary electron center. Within the membrane, the thylakoid membrane, there's an electron transport chain, just like in the mitochondria, where each transfer pumps a proton into the space within the thylakoid membrane, so on the inside of those green stacks. It's called the lumen space. And at the end, there is a proton pump, just like in cellular respiration, where ATP is generated. Now there's a second photosystem here, where the same thing happens. These electrons from the initial photosystem have been passed through the electron transport chain to another photosystem. This one has a stronger pull on electrons than this one does, so this is sort of working against electronegativity. That's the point of all the handing off of electrons. But these make it to the secondary photosystem. So 2 electrons get passed here. Light comes in. 2 more photons bounce the pigments around, and 2 electrons are transferred to another primary electron acceptor, which then hands them off to NAD+, making NADPH. The overall importance of the photosynthetic process here is that ATP, energy, is generated, as well as NADPH. It has electrons on it, so it is ready to participate in further reactions. Your book has this picture to kind of try to show you the energy level of the electrons. So when a photon comes in, electron gets super excited, its energy level shoots up, and then it's handed down the chain, kind of like the stairs that we saw in cellular respiration. Another photon comes in, kicks that energy level up one more time, and then it falls to NAD+, or NADPH. This is a better picture showing you each step within the membrane. So this is inside the thylakoid, which is also called the lumen, and this is the membrane. These are the photosystems. Light has to come in and energize the electron that had been attached to water and get transported through the electron transport chain, and hydrogen plus ions get pumped into the membrane. And remember, oxygen is also broken off here, so you've got more hydrogens that are generated at this point. Once those electrons are transferred to a secondary photosystem, more photons come in to energize those electrons again, that eventually get transferred to NADPH. Then NADPH is able to go to the Calvin cycle, where these electrons will assist the cell in generating sugar from carbon dioxide. This protein pump, just like before, is how ATP is made. You've got the proton gradient in here. The protons are trying to get out. The ATP synthase regulates that process by allowing them through essentially just one at a time and rotating the molecules here that connect ADP to a phosphate group, generating ATP. So I hope going over that several times in several different ways with several different pictures will help cement it in your head, because it's going to be important to understand the process as we move forward in talking about the Calvin cycle. So remember, in this video we only talked about light-dependent reactions, the reactions in the chloroplast that require light. That would be the breaking of water and the harvesting of photon energies to make electrons available for the proton pump to generate ATP, and then later for the Calvin cycle to generate sugar. We went over the properties of light, how photons have different amounts of energy associated with them and how they're measured and based on wavelength. Why chloroplasts and leaves look green is because that is the spectrum that they do not absorb. We went over the parts of the plant that have something to do with photosynthesis. The ones that are new to you are the stoma or stomata, the granum, the thylakoid membrane, which is the membrane of the little green guys, and the stroma, which is the liquid surrounding the granum within the chloroplast. And then we went over how light is harvested on the pigment molecules within the thylakoid membrane, essentially through an electron transport chain, much like cellular respiration, except the energy is being increased on those electrons by the absorption of photons, as opposed to decreased and falling down the scale being drawn by oxygen. That was cellular respiration. And this light-dependent reaction generates ATP and NADPH for photosynthesis.